Like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, we are given in Bernard Malamuds' The Jewbird an improbable and richly symbolic premise, a dene that violates the boundaries of realism and requires once again that willing suspension of disbelief. Instead of an old man with enormous wings, we have an old man, well, who looks like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, identifies himself as a Jewbird, and says his name is Schwartz. The Jewbird flies into the top floor apartment of the Cohen family, who live on First Avenue near the Lower East Side River in New York. This the story begins. The window was open, so the skinny bird flew in. Flippity-flap, with its frazzled black wings. That's how it goes. It's open, you're in. Closed, you're out. And that's your fate. The bird wearily flapped through the open kitchen window of Harry Cohen's top-floor apartment on First Avenue near the Lower East River. On a rod on the wall hung an escaped canary cage, its door wide open. But this black-type long-beaked bird, its ruffled head and small dull eyes crossed a little, making it look like a dissipated crow, landed, if not smack on Cohen's thick lamb chop, at least on the table close by. Now, I want to begin with the beginning here because it's important to realize that there's a kind of idiom right from the beginning. There's a rhythm to the language that captures the senses as well as the ear. And I try to read it to give it that sense. The window was open, so the skinny bird flew in. Flippity-flap with its frazzled black wings, that's how it goes. It's open, you're in. Closed, you're out. That's your fate. It's really from the point of view of the bird, but it takes on a universal sense of life being in and out. Suddenly you're in, and then you're out, which certainly is often how life is, metaphorically as well as realistically. But it also has that cadence of the old world Yiddish quality to it, to the language. It's very recognizable, and it gets close to the actual character that we're going to meet, the bird, because that's how he talks. But it's embedded in the narrative, which is omniscient. It gets into detail about Cohen sitting there with his lamb chop and so forth, and that sounds more like an omniscient voice. But the initial voice is one that to some extent is almost indistinguishable from Schwartz, the bird, who takes on a real-life character. He's running from anti-Semites, is how he says it. And he's seeking refuge and charity from the Cohens. But what happens in the story is that Harry Cohen swiftly becomes his antagonist, persecutes and torments him, despite the fact that Schwartz manages to establish over the course of the story, and it's a rather short story, establish a tender tutoring relationship with the Cohen's son, Maury. And he appears to be liked and respected by Cohen's wife, Edie. In the winter, Cohen throws Schwartz out of the apartment. Schwartz is found by Maury in the spring. We go through all of this seasonal change. The spring is usually, of course, a time associated in literary conventions with blooming, with resurrection, with fertility, but there's Schwartz. He's all crushed. He's physically mangled. And when Forey asks Cohen who did the violence to him, Edie replies, anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism was for centuries a virulent force throughout Europe, throughout the world really. Jews came to the United States to escape religious persecution, and anti-Semitism in all its forms, in all its varieties, they found not as prevalent in the United States. In fact, they found refuge and freedom from religious persecution in the United States. Semites, by the way, are Jews and Arabs, but anti-Semitism became lexically identified with hatred or bigotry against Jews, with persecution against the Jews. You may recall in my lecture on Grace Paley, I spoke about the mother of a girl in one of her stories talking about a creeping pogrom that suggested loss of Jewish identity resulting from assimilation. This is a theme of these writers who took center stage in American literature, like Paley and Malamud, who had roots in Europe, who were first generation. Their parents were born in Russia and came here through immigration. And they faced the whole sense of the paradox of not having as much overt anti-Semitism in the United States and having freedom from persecution, not having to worry about pogroms, and yet experiencing perhaps more subtle forms of anti-Semitism and facing the fact that Jews themselves could be anti-Semitic, which is to say self-hating or discriminatory toward their own kind. Can Jews who assimilate and lose their Jewish identity become anti-Semites? Well, this appears to be one of the more challenging questions that Malamud grapples with in The Jewbird. There's an old joke about a radio announcer. The guy tries out for a job as a radio announcer, And he doesn't get the job, and his friend says, well, why do you think he didn't get the job? And he says, anti-Semitism. I mean, funny joke, because it suggests that Jews can blame all their travails on anti-Semitism, even a guy who has a stutter and doesn't get a job as a radio announcer. But clearly, Malamud takes quite seriously, as we shall see, the idea of what came to be called self-hating Jews or even anti-Semitic Jews in this story. Malamud distinguished himself as a novelist as well as a short story writer. He received 2 National Book Awards, a Pulitzer Prize, and an O. Henry Award. He was born in Brooklyn in 1914 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents, went to City College and Columbia, taught English at Oregon State and at Bennington, where Shirley Jackson's husband taught. And Jewbird was part of his second collection of short stories called Idiot's Verse, which appeared in 1963. Before we talk about the Jewbird, I should mention that his first collection featured one of his other most famous stories, the title story, which is strangely evocative of a kind of magical realism, as is the Jewbird in many ways. It's called, in fact, The Magic Barrel. And it's the story of a young rabbinical student, actually Leo Finkel is his name, who is studying for the rabbinate, and feels that he should take the old traditional route and find a mate for himself. And he goes to a matchmaker. And the matchmaker really tries to sell him on all these various, matchmakers called shadchan, they're called shadchans, tries to sell him on all these various young women that he has, and not so young women, who would be presumably fit wives for him. And then a strange thing happens. He doesn't find anyone, he tries a few dates and they don't work, he becomes disillusioned with the matchmaker, and then he sees a picture in there and he's struck by the suffering in the eyes of the young woman, and something about her just absolutely captures him. And it turns out it's the matchmaker's daughter. How did her picture get in there? That's part of the whole mystery of the story. It's mystery again at the essence of the story. Maybe he put it in there, maybe he didn't, maybe it just fell in there, but the fact is he's disowned her. She seems to be associated with street walking or prostitution of some kind. And what we see is this Chagall-like world where everything is turned upside down at the end and things happen as if by destiny, kismet, fate. And fate plays a preeminent role throughout Malamud's work, as does the sense of suffering. The young rabbinical student is drawn to suffering, and so is Bernard Malamud. He felt that it was, in many ways, identifiably a Jewish trait or somehow identifiable with Jewish history. Malamud was also identified with a number of other Jewish writers, Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, American Jewish writers. They were part of a triumvirate of American male Jewish writers. So common, in fact, was the linking of these 3 names that Bellow once remarked how it began to sound to him like Hart, Schaffner, and Marx, the famous clothing manufacturer. Roth, a younger writer than the other 2, eulogized Malamud upon his death as a man of stern morality, whose conscience, quote, was tortuously exacerbated by the pathos of human need unabated. And that's really what makes Malamud's stories so compelling, that pathos about human need that Roth, I think, correctly identified. There is in this story that kind of pathos, despite the fact that it's personified or embodied in a bird. And we'll get to the story, but let me talk a little bit more about Malamud. He worked much stronger and more intensely than did the other 2 Jewish writers I mentioned, with traditional Jewish themes of suffering and victimization, exile, and the role of being marginal or an outsider. And we see in his work also the paramount importance of the law and morality. Probably Malamud's best-known novel is The Natural, which was made into a film about a baseball player. It had nothing to do with Jewish identity, really. It's kind of an all-American guy, but it certainly had to do with suffering. And one of Malamud's most famous statements was that all men are Jews, though few men know it, by which he meant life universally involves suffering and the existential condition of being a potential victim simply because one is human. Later on, when we discuss a short story by African-American writer James Baldwin, we'll see once again the motif of human suffering, but linked to black identity. Later, Malamud amended his statement to say, all men are Jews except they don't know it. This echoes, by the way, the Christian existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who said all men are in despair, and those who don't know they are in despair are in the worst despair. One of Malamud's most famous novels was a novel called The Assistant. And it's a novel about, actually in Italian, who's a thief by the name of Frankie Alpine. And he goes and molests the daughter of a grocer by the name of Morris Bober, a name that is, well, evocative at least of the great existential Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, the author of I and Thou. And he becomes, after breaking into the grocery store, and the people live in the grocery store, the Bobers do, he becomes enamored of the daughter, he becomes filled with a sense of guilt and contrition, and ultimately he undergoes a conversion. Malamud tries to show in that novel the sense of suffering and of the law, both tied together, of following the law, following this sort of rigid moral code, and doing it in such a way that it echoes back to, say, Talmudic law, or it echoes back really to the covenant in the Old Testament, and the sense the Jews had of being devout in terms of trying to follow the law as it's prescribed by the 5 books of Moses and Scripture. And Frankie Alpine becomes a Jew because he understands the importance of the law. Even though he's a rehabilitated criminal, he understands the importance of suffering as well. This is classic Malamud. He also gets circumcised at the end in order to reflect upon his new faith, and it's rather painful, we at least should add by way of footnote. The Fixer, which was published in 1966, is another Malamud novel about suffering. It fictionalizes a true case of suffering and injustice that took place in Russia in 1913, right before Malamud was born, with the trial of a Jew named Menachem Mendel Bellis. This poor persecuted man is like Gogol's Akaki. He's an everyman. He's a man whom Malamud draws for us in ways that project onto his story the human universality of suffering. It is a story about suffering, about persecution, about anti-Semitism. It all takes place in Russia, and it's all based on fact. On the other hand, we move into a story like The Jewbird, and it is a story, and it's a miniaturized vision of many of the ideas that Malamud grapples with, and it fuses a sense of suffering that he identifies particularly with the old world of European Jewry. But there's a real cartoon-like effect that we get in The Jewbird. It comes from Schwartz, this rather bedraggled-looking bird, but it fuses itself with human qualities and human characteristics, which is evocative again of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, in which Gregor Samsa wakes up as a cockroach, or of Art Spiegelman's Maus, in which Jews are mice and Nazis are cats. And by the way, in this story, the cat persecutes and torments poor Schwartz. His adversary, Cohen, brings the cat in to do just that. Schwartz, the Jewbird, becomes associated right away with the old world of ghettoized, Ashkenazi, shtetl Jewry, the world of what's called Yiddishkeit, or Yiddish culture, folk culture, that occasionally, as we see in the story, will still perch itself in a Jewish home and can enter uninvited into the lives of assimilating Jews, because that's indeed what particularly Harry Cohen is. Schwartz speaks in Yiddish, and he's of the shtetl. Early on in the story, he says, Gewalt, a pogrom. Remember, I think it was Woody Allen's Sleeper, I believe it was Woody Allen's Sleeper, where Diane Keaton, who is, I guess what you could call a kind of prototypical shiksa or Gentile girl, is reading from a script from Woody Allen's, or the character that Woody Allen portrays, life as a boy, and says, Oi Gewalt, instead of Oi Gewalt, which means, oh God, God in heaven. I mean, you read a story like The Jewbird, and you don't necessarily recognize Yiddish, although Yiddish words have become so much a part of the American lexicon. We take them for granted. You know, words like kibbutz, for example, or schmooze. But what they signify in this story is that Schwartz has Yiddish roots, and that he, we also find out, has experienced what so many in the shtetl and the old world under anti-Semitism experienced, the victimization of a pogrom. He says, Oi, a pogrom. And other Yiddish words move throughout the story. Gruber Jung, which means a lowlife or a vulgar person. It's used twice by Schwartz to describe Harry Cohen. It's a very pejorative, obviously, way of saying that someone is of low class, vulgar. And the word chutzpah appears as well, also used by the bird and used at one point by Harry Cohen, which I'll mention. By the way, the old saw is, chutzpah means kind of moxie or strength of character, willingness to be really feisty and intense if necessary, aggressive. They say if you can't say it, you don't have it. Chutzpah. Well, Schwartz speaks with an accent. He speaks in these cadences that are distinctly Yiddish. They're Yiddish-based, they're idiomatic, and they're transliteratable from Yiddish. As when he asks Edie Cohen, if you'll open the jar for me, I'll eat marinated. Do you have also, if you don't mind, the piece of rye bread, the spitz? This begins to sound a little bit like the comedian Jackie Mason. It's recognizably understandable because this rhythm of Yiddish blended into English, what became called Yinglish, has a recognizable cadence to it, has a recognizable rhythm that combines to have locutions and to have qualities of speech that are really quite recognizable. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful jokes that exemplify what I'm talking about. There's a joke about the old Jewish man, for example, from the shtetl, who takes his grandson and says to him, come on, we're going to go for a swim. And there are big signs that say no swimming allowed. And in fact, they're huge. It says no swimming allowed with exclamation marks, and underneath it, it says it again in bigger, bolder letters, no swimming allowed with exclamation marks. And the grandson looks up at his grandfather and says, Grandpa, how can we go swimming? It says no swimming allowed. And he says, no, it says no swimming allowed. No, swimming allowed. So you just take that kind of Yiddish character of language and the locutions and rhythms of language and see how it can be very funny. And Malamud, in writing Jewbird, is creating kind of a stock comic character as well. These recognizable Yiddish locutions and ways of speech, manners of speech, are humorous, they're folksy, they come out of Yiddishkeit or Yiddish culture. And Schwartz is nearly a stock, old-world, Ashkenazi Jewish character. By Ashkenazi, I mean the Jews from Eastern Europe for the most part, or the Jews that settled throughout the European continent. There were the Ashkenazi and there were the Sephardic, and the Sephardic were the North African or Spanish Jews who spoke not Yiddish at all, but another language called Ladino and had a very different culture. Schwartz eats herring, he drinks schnapps, he's an old radical, and he's a Malamud. By the way, similar spelling, often pronounced the same way as the author's name, but Malamed actually means teacher in Hebrew. He also epitomizes a Yiddish folk character known as a schnorrer. And a schnorrer is seen in many Yiddish folk tales and many oral tales. It's essentially a man who lives off of the charity of others. In fact, it even is a verb, to schnorr. To schnorr means, to try to get something for nothing or to try to make one's way in the world by essentially, living off the good grace of others or the good charity of others. Often, by the way, in the folklore and the myths that come out of the Yiddish culture, out of Yiddishkeit, and remember that the Jews were always waiting for the Messiah. The Christians had their Messiah in Jesus. But the Jews did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, and therefore they were waiting, particularly through their experience in Europe, living under anti-Semitism, living in often terrible poverty in shtetls, waiting for the Messiah to come and redeem them. Often thought to be a figure who would come on a white horse and take them out of their misery and stop all the bigotry and pogroms and the like. And this notion that there is a messianic force that will come into the world was thought to be, curiously, in Yiddish culture, tied to how beggars were treated, because it was believed that they were sometimes sent by God directly to test the charity of human beings on earth toward those who were in need. There's a famous shtetl folktale, for example, about the Lamed Vovnik, righteous men who are on earth to test the goodness of humankind by asking for handouts as a test of human goodness. And the messianic prophecy was believed to be linked to how those beggars were treated, what kindness or charity they were able to receive. People were being tested all the time. You come into this story and you realize that here's a schnorrer, Schwartz. He's looking for a place to settle. He's looking for herring and to be fed and to be taken care of and a place where he can escape the cold and so forth. He's a classical schnorrer. Harry Cohen finds his presence not to his liking, to put it mildly. In fact, as I said, he becomes Schwartz's antagonist. He's out to do the bird in. hates him. And it has a lot to do with his hatred of his heritage, his hatred of where he came from, his European past and so forth. But it also reflects on a lot of these old folk tales from Yiddish culture. Because if God is judging on the basis of Harry Cohen and the way he behaves toward Schwartz, then this is a pretty bad and disturbing judgment. The Jewbird is also black. His name is Schwartz, which is Schwarz, a word that's commonly used often by Jews to reference black people. It means black. Hence, aside from being a Jewbird, which Schwartz tells Cohen is once removed from a Jewfish, there you can see that kind of exotic humor of Malamuds, he is the perennial outsider, the marginal victim figure who is the dual target of hatred because he's a Jew and he's black. There's an old joke about the entertainer Sammy Davis, part of the Rat Pack, singer, dancer, extraordinary figure in entertainment, identified with Las Vegas and all that, who converted to Judaism back in the 50s. A number of entertainers did. It's kind of a philo-Semitism that followed after the Second World War, as opposed to anti-Semitism. Elizabeth Taylor converted, or a number of majors, Marilyn Monroe converted. But the joke is that Sammy Davis gets on a bus, it's in the South, it's during segregation, and the bus driver says, "Get to the back of the bus." And he says, "But I'm Jewish." And the driver says, "Get off the bus." Well, Malamud kind of brings that joke to the fore, because why does Cohen hate Schwartz? He hates him because he's Jewish and represents his own Jewish past and heritage, but he also hates him because he's black. And so there's bigotry and anti-Semitism kind of operating together in the story, if you will. I should mention that after the Second World War, Jews became representative often of the human condition in their dislocation, that is their history of dislocation, exile, and victimhood in literature. A lot of this began in the 20th century with Leopold Bloom in the great modernist novel Ulysses by James Joyce, which was published in 1922 and served as a model for the Jew being seen as a universal character. Boundaries in the short story were being broken that reflected boundaries in publishing that were being crossed. Women, Jews, and blacks, and people of color, both the authors who came from those once regarded as parochial and limited backgrounds, as well as the characters they created, were moving more into a general acceptance as being universal. This story, The Jewbird, it's a fable. It's a mythic blending of the old European shtetl world, symbolized by Schwartz, and the assimilated world of American Jewry, as symbolized by, and note the occupation, frozen food salesman Harry Cohen. They become adversaries. Cohen becomes Schwartz's nemesis. Our first image or picture of Cohen is of him eating a thick lamb chop, wearing beefy shorts, and drinking beer. And these are antithetical to the stereotypes of a Jew and fit more with the way many Jews have stereotypically characterized what they call the Goyim, or the non-Jews, the Gentiles. When Schwartz prays, Edie bows her head, but not Cohen. The son, Maurice, also rocks with prayer. Both mother and son, like Schwartz and unlike Cohen, seem responsive to prayer, to God really. Though when Cohen asks the bird why he has no hat or phylacteries, that is, thing that are bound for prayer with the prayer shawl, the tallis, Schwartz explains that he's an old radical. But the old radical continues to be observant in his fashion, while Cohen, by contrast, appears to have no feeling for religion, no charity in his heart. His Yiddish is lousy. I mentioned the word chutzpah. Well, we see this when he incorrectly uses the indefinite article to describe what he feels is Schwartz's chutzpah. You can't say it if you don't have it, but never use the article. Cohen's mother is dying in the story. And when she dies, along with his son's school failure, the story moves toward its resolution, and Cohen, waging all-out war against his adversary, Cohen, the emissary from his past and from his Jewish roots, against that enemy. Cohen, a Jew, becoming the force of anti-Semitism that Schwartz fears. Cohen is entrapped by American status values. We see this when he shows excitement at the mistaken notion of a possibility that his son Maury might be on a path toward admission to a prestigious Ivy League school. At least he gets that in his head. Cohen becomes angry at Schwartz's assessment that Maury will never be a scholar, though he believes Maury a good boy. Cohen is told by Schwartz, well, your son won't be a shicker or a wife-beater. Shicker, by the way, is Yiddish for a drunk. And there's an old Yiddish maxim, the shicker is the goy, meaning the drunk is the Gentile. And once again, this is a stereotyping of Gentiles by Jews, but it also evokes a Jewish past associated with drunken Cossacks or other Gentile anti-Semites who were involved in pogroms, often drunk in their attacks upon the ghettoized Jewish populations. In traditional Judaism, there's a caste. It's a hierarchy in which those of the most noble and highest status were called the Kohanes, which is why so many Jews have a variation of that as their last name, Cohen. It's especially ironic that Malamuds' character has this name. The binary of the old shtetl and Americanized frozen food Jewish males, the vulnerable and feathery living by his witch Schwartz versus the beefy and brawny bully Cohen, is right at the core of this fable, where the self-hating Jew destroys the shabby and embarrassing remnant of his past while he had tried to keep shut out with the window closed, until the Jewbird suddenly and unexpectedly flew in. The brutal killing of the old lady's goose by Lyotov in My First Goose is done to gain the acceptance of the Cossack soldiers. But Lyotov, the story's narrator, suffers remorse and a pained conscience. No such affliction bothers Harry Cohen, the frozen food salesman, though Cohen is admittedly a flat and stereotypical Bulvan character, a kind of Jewish Cossack. Leo Rostin, who wrote The Joys of Speaking Yiddish, said, instead of bull in a china shop, you had Cossacks in a sukkah in the world of Yiddish culture, a sukkah being that hut the Jews built to celebrate the festival of the fruit. Cohen's hatred for Schwartz goes beyond what Schwartz represents, or even the past. He hates the bird's smell, though Schwartz points out that Cohen smells too. He hates his snoring, even accuses the old bird of wanting to sleep with his wife, Edie, which elicits the most singularly amusing line in the story. Wonderful example of Malamuds' humor in an otherwise tragic and pity-inducing tale. Mr. Cohen, on this rest assured, a bird is a bird. Ultimately, this is a moral fable about the loss of Jewish identity that assimilation brings. Even though Cohen is left, because of the bird, with a grossly swollen nose, the caricature and stereotypical mark of Jewish identity for many, yet Maury, Cohen's tender-hearted son, is moved by memory in the mythic resurrecting spring and weeps for the loss of the bird and its hideous death, which includes, like Oedipus, eyes plucked out. Edie, his mother, is able to state the final line of the story, attributing Schwartz's awful death to what Schwartz had early on indicated he was trying to escape: anti-Semites. Malamud helped to establish with his fable, but even more with his earlier work, which included stories that began to appear in leading magazines such as Harper's Bazaar, the Partisan Review, and Commentary in the early 1950s, a firm place for American Jewish identity in short fiction that also helped to open up barriers for more ethnic writing and for fiction emblazoned with an ethnic identity derived from ethnic material. Which brings us to our next writer and masterpiece storyteller, the great African-American writer James Baldwin. As the once inviolable but white man-dominated Western canon of great literature begins to open up to greater diversity, to more women writers, to more Jewish, black, multicultural writing, we see the outpouring of stories by women short story writers, and we see the outpouring also of different ethnic writers and writers of different racial backgrounds who well deserve the masterpiece laurels. There were probably a lot of talented writers who certainly didn't get the recognition they deserved, as we've said, but this begins to take place, that is, the recognition, and it begins to change. James Baldwin, for example, rose right out of Harlem to give us a story about Harlem that is nothing short of extraordinary. It's called Sonny's Blues, and it's the next story we're going to deal with, and it's a story also, like the Jewbird, about suffering, but with a poignancy and with a resonance about our humanity, just like the Jewbird, that goes much deeper than that.